So I'm going to be talking about automating Angular. And if we're being really honest, it's mostly about automating and not as much about Angular. But I am going to be talking about some Angular-related things. So I'm Charles Max Wood. Most of what I do these days is the podcasts. I spend a lot of time building processes and working on the podcasts. So I do podcasts. How many of you listen to Adventures in Angular or JavaScript Jabber or one of the other shows we do at devchat.tv? I see a few hands. I love meeting people who listen to the shows, so please come talk to me afterward. And I'd love to get your feedback, hear what you're doing, hear what you're working on, and just get to know you a little bit better. So yeah, definitely just make it a point to come see me because I really want to talk to you. What else do I have up here? Software. So I've been doing software for about 11 years. I started out doing Ruby on Rails, went through the jQuery and Backbone. I played with some Ember because of the Rails connection, right? And then eventually got into Angular. And I got into Angular because some friends of mine, Joe Eames, Merritt Christensen, and Aaron Frost, told me that I needed to do an Angular podcast. I didn't feel good about doing an Angular podcast without learning some Angular. So I have played with Angular for quite a long time. And I'm married. My wife and I celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary last month. We have 5 kids. Everybody asks, so I'm just telling you. I have 5 kids, ages 12, 11, 9, 7, not 7, he'll be 7 in August, and 2. So we stay busy at my place, and I live in Utah. So I like to start out my talks by talking about why. And when we're talking about automation, there's a really clear why. I talk to a lot of people outside of the podcast. I go to conferences, I come to events like this, I go to meetups. I also have a place where people can get on and talk to me for 15 minutes and ask me questions. And I talk to them. And probably the most common question I get is, I'm really new to programming, how do I get a job? And that's not what we're talking about tonight. The next most common question, though, is usually somebody who's a little more experienced, working on a team, and they're asking, how do we get better people? Or how do we keep the people we have? Or something like that. I see a lot of heads nodding. This is a problem that we have, right? Most developers, if they have any kind of experience and they have a job where there's something they don't like, it's really easy for them to go somewhere else. And what we're finding is that we have a lot of new people coming in, but it's really hard to find experienced people to replace them. I see more heads nodding. So when I'm talking about automation, I feel like this is really the answer to this question or this problem. So let's go ahead and talk through it. So the big questions are, how do I find senior developers? I get asked this all the time, and we'll get to it. But we're going to kind of get there in a roundabout way. How do I keep and train junior developers? Because usually once we talk about how to hire and the process they have to go through, I ask them why they're not hiring and training junior developers, and usually the answer is either I don't have the time to train them, or my experience is that I train them and then everybody in the industry is telling them to go find their next job, and so we lose them. To which I usually say, well, then pay them more and give them no reason to leave, but it's not always that simple. And in the meantime, you're still shorthanded, right? You still need those people working on the things that you need worked on. And so what do you do in the meantime? How can you bridge some of that gap so that you can eventually get to the place where you're getting everything done that you need done? And finally, how do we keep the people that we've already got? And really, what I find is that in most cases, when people are struggling with any of these issues, they have one problem. and it takes many forms, and that is chaos. Right? So just when you're about to show up with dinner, something's on fire. But you see this, everybody has a different thing that's on fire, right? For some people it's hiring, for other people it's every time we deploy something's broken. For other people it's we're using Angular JS and nobody wants to work on that anymore because they want to use the current technology. Everybody has these issues. So we're going to talk about how to automate our way around them and kind of open up the possibilities so that we can deal with these things. So what is automation? It's the stuff that you have happen that you don't really have to think about. And generally I think of this as kind of two forms of automation. There's the automation where, you do or don't press a button and things happen. The right things happen in a repeatable way. Somebody said that. And then you've got the things where it's automated because I don't have to think about what the next step is, but I still have to do the next step, if that makes sense. So I can go to my list or my checklist or whatever and work through that. Now, this talk is kind of a 10,000-foot view. I'm going to dig into some of these, what some of these tools are, but I'm not going to show you how to use a lot of them, okay? I really want you to understand the principle of this, and then think about how this can be applied where you're at. And I'll pause for questions at the end, and I'm happy to help you kind of figure out where that gap is for you. But since I don't know what your individual situations are, I feel like if I focus on any one tool for too long, I'm going to leave something out that somebody else may be inspired to go look into. So, for those of us who aren't the programmer manager, what's in it for us with the automation, right? What do we get out of it? Well, for me, I just want to write code. That's my deal, right? I want to write code. And I want to write code that people love to use. Okay? That's my deal. So getting it deployed to the server, that's not my deal, right? I want it to get out there so people can use it and they can love it. But for me, I just want to write code. I want to solve problems. I just want to see this stuff work. And that's the payoff for me when I write software. So, in order to get there, I have to do more, okay? I've got to write more code. I want to build more features. I want to push my stuff out more often so people can use the new stuff that I'm building. You kind of see where we're going with this? And I want to make more money. But let's face it, right? Feed me more. I want to make more money. I don't want to worry about everything else, okay? I don't want to worry about it. I just want it to happen. And as somebody said before, I just want it to be predictable, okay? I want to be able to set a process in motion and see the future. Just know what it's going to do. And I want it to be really, really easy. And finally, I want it to be automatic. So I push code in, all the tests get run, it gets deployed, I don't have to think about it, my users are happy, I'm happy. So the way that I think about these processes and think about this particular approach is I talk about it as scripts and scripts, okay? So you've got the code, the scripts that you write, or the scripts that you run on your CI machine, or the scripts that you run on your own machine to generate code. And then you've got these other scripts, which are the steps that you follow as you act out a process in order to make it happen. And both of those are important. So let's talk about the first kind of scripts. These are kind of the sanity checks on your code or processes that you can completely automate away. You don't push a button, they just happen, okay? Or worst case scenario, you run a command and they happen. So you have code generators. How many of you have used the Angular CLI? Start a new project to generate new portions, components, things like that in the project. Did you know that you can customize those with schematics? How many of you like writing boilerplate? Oh, I saw one hand. Lucky guy. Outsource all of your boilerplate to him, everybody else, schematics, okay? When I got into Ruby on Rails, everybody complained about the Rails scaffold generator. And it would generate basically a REST API endpoint setup for you. But the problem is we'd all have to go in and delete half of the code in there because it wasn't what we wanted. And I have to wonder how many of us are doing the same thing with something like the Angular CLI. Well, in my components, I'm going to pull in this visual library, or I'm going to pull in this other tool, so Angular material, things like that. I don't know if the Angular CLI generates tests for you, or if it does, if it's using the right test framework, if you prefer something else. So go customize that. Don't spend 10 minutes every time you generate code generating the wrong code. Test runners like Mocha, Jasmine, and Jest. So every time you change your code, it just runs the test. You don't have to hit a button. It just works. Continuous integration. So again, you get these tests to run. You run the whole suite. Because most of these test runners will just run the things that changed, right? So your continuous integration will tell you if what you did affected something else. Build tools like Webpack and Blaze. Your deployments should all be automated. Backups and disaster recovery, so your databases and things like that. End-to-end tests, so you can use something like Cypress or Selenium. Style enforcement, so coding style is what I'm looking at, like JSLint or ESLint. Static and code analysis, code review tools. Codacy is a sponsor of one of the shows, that's why I put them up there, but there are a whole bunch of them. We'll talk about those in a minute too. Text editor macros, documentation generators, error tracking systems, and server and workload monitoring. So what difference does this make? I mean, we started out talking about the problem of hiring people, right? And now we're talking about all these tools that we use to automate all this stuff. So what kind of a difference does this make? Well, for one, you do this work one time, and then it saves you 5 minutes, and then 5 more minutes, and then 5 more minutes, or an hour, and another hour, and another hour. I've seen some deployment processes that once they automated it, it literally saved them a day every time they deployed. So that's one thing, right? You're saving time that you didn't have before that you can spend making up for that person that you need to hire. The other thing is if somebody comes in and starts working on your code and you have these things in place, then all of these tools provide a check for them to know whether or not they're working in the way that you want to work. And so you've got all these tools that will do that work for you and make it easier for you to onboard other people. So let's talk about the other scripts. How about development processes like agile development? Deployment procedures. So this comes down to whether you do a big release and how you handle that, and whether or not somebody's validating the release, or whether you deploy often and you just kind of trust the process because it happens so often that you just know it works. Testing practices, source control messaging, debugging, critical bugs and on-call, meetings, hiring. I'm going to dig into this in a minute. But these are all areas where here's how we do it. Here's how you do your job. Here's how you take these steps in order to make these things happen. And the reason that this is important is because once you know how all of this stuff works, then you're put into a position where your contributions and the people who are joining you, their contributions, can follow this script. In other words, you already can tell this person how to do their job. And if you're hiring somebody to do all these things, then you know the kind of person you need to hire, because you know how the deployments will happen. You know how you write source control messages. You know how all of these things go together. So let's go back to our coding solutions for a minute. I kind of see these as happening in 3 different places. They happen on your developer machine, they probably happen on some kind of build or CI machine, and then they happen in production. And we kind of talked through a lot of these, but you know, we've got schematics and CLI. We've got our test runners. And again, you know, back to talking about process, are you doing TDD? Is that important to you? Or do you just want test written? Is that important to you? I mean, what does your test process look like? End-to-end testing, same thing, right? When, how? How did all these tools go together? I listed text editor macros. I mean, these are the things, the text editor macros, that make it so that I can easily and quickly edit the code that I'm working on. And so this is kind of personal productivity. The documentation generators, there's Doco, ESDoc, I think YUI has a doc generator. But are you using these tools in order to help people understand your code as they come in? Are these tools that will help make the job easier for somebody that's coming in and working in your company? Is this something not just when you're onboarding, but you can kind of throw at somebody and say, okay, here's all the documentation for the project, and as your test code, we want you to work on this piece or pair on this piece and see how quickly they can come up to speed. I think we've all heard about continuous integration. I see some people smiling about the animations. I think this is a really easy thing to plug in. And even if you don't have tests to run or some kind of build process to run in it, setting up a CI machine on its own is pretty easy, and then you can start putting those tests in as you go. So you can start taking the steps to automate the checks on your code that are going to get you to higher quality. And then you avoid all the issues that come up in production, all the build issues, all of the other problems that you're going to run across as you work through the code. I put this picture in here mainly because this was a terrific talk about how to build and deploy your Angular applications. There's a ton of information out there for this. And once you have it working in Docker, which is what this talk was about, it's pretty easy to automate that. And so you can put that into your CI system as a build step. And then you can know that it all happens in a repeatable way. Your style guides and linting. What does your code look like? What do you want it to look like? How much does the style matter to your team? How do you approach it? How do you review it? Another one is static analysis. How many of you have used the static analysis tools that are available for JavaScript? A few? So looking at your code from different angles and running these tools against your code are going to give you some ideas of where the problem areas are, and then you can make sure to test those more thoroughly. How about error tracking? Anyone using an error tracking system? I mean, the two that have sponsored my shows are Airbreak and Rollbar. I think New Relic has some bits of this built in. Sentry.
Logs. The server side.
Yeah, logs on the server side. That's always fun, right?
Yeah.
Grep. Go grep that baby. But that's the point, right? Is grepping through the log is this manual process that takes time.
Oh, sorry, gray logs.
Oh, gray logs? Yeah, so that'll aggregate your logs into a readable way. But yeah, so you've got all these systems that will pull your information together and aggregate it in a way that makes it automated and easy to follow. And all of these things will save you time, make it easier on your people, and then they can focus on what they like to do. And so, bringing it back to that idea of retention and bringing it back to the idea of being a place that people want to work, it's like, look, we've got all these tools in place. We do all of these things so that when we deploy, we don't expect you to be here at 10 p.m. while we're deploying and then crossing our fingers that we can be out of here by 10:30. I've had this job before, folks. And so at 6 a.m., I call my wife because I think she's probably awake by then. Right? Yeah, dear, we're still here. We deployed it and we couldn't roll it back. And so we're still trying to fix it in place. I'll probably be home by lunch. Right? I mean, that's just no fun. And nobody wants to work that. I was having a conversation with Jesse, and he mentioned that occasionally they'll have a client that needs more than 40 hours in a week's worth of work. And he mentioned that one of his values is that he doesn't want his people working too many hours too often. If you want to keep people, that's probably a good thing to stick to, or at least, keep to the expectations that they have. And so if we can put these things in place to make sure that we're keeping track of at least the parts of the job that are hard, the parts of the job that nobody wants to do, and that when we have to do the parts of the job that nobody wants to do, we have things in place like the error tracking so that it's easy to track it down because it aggregates every instance of that error, puts it all in one place, and then lets me pick through it to see what's there. It looks at my code and tells me, you know what, this could probably be simpler. Or looks through my code and says, that's not the way that we format these things, or that's not the way that we do these particular things. So putting all these things in place, it makes a nice environment for us, but it also makes it so that we don't have to spend a bunch of extra time or hire another person to compensate for all of the things that are on fire when we try and deliver. Any questions so far? There's one up there.
I'm curious, excuse me, does this all depend on scale? Is there a certain area where if you're not scaling as high that you wouldn't have to worry about this? It does apply to everything at every scale?
So the question is, I've given enough of these talks to know that the mic doesn't pick you up from all the way over there. The question is there a certain scale or a certain level of scale where these things begin to matter and when they don't? And generally my answer is that, and this is my consultant background speaking, it depends.
I've heard that before.
Yeah, you've heard that before, right? So here's the situation. Every team is different, right? So if I'm working on something on my own, then I have to shore up my own deficiencies. And if I'm working on something with a team of 3 or 4 people, then I have to shore up that team's deficiencies. And certain things are going to become painful, and other things are not going to be painful. And that really comes down to my experience and what I've done, and the areas that I've worked in, and I better have continuous integration in place, because otherwise I'm going to pay for it, because my experience tells me that. Where somebody else may have extremely good testing practice, and they can avoid the need necessarily for continuous integration for a little while, because they tend to cover the cases that the continuous integration would have caught for me. And then eventually what happens is they check in passing tests, I check in passing tests, but our code mixes and breaks stuff. And so then we start, okay, now we have this pain, how do we solve it? Well, it's continuous integration. And you could have preempted that, and it probably would have saved you some time and effort and some pain, but the truth of the matter is that some of these things are going to matter more than others under certain circumstances. And so I encourage you to look at these areas and implement the ones that are kind of low cost, high reward, and I think continuous integration is one of those. But at the same time, just be aware that there are a lot of these other areas, a lot of these other systems that will account for some of these other pain areas. And if you just stop and communicate and say, okay, what's on fire? Where's the chaos? Where are things breaking down? Then you can start looking at, okay, how do we automate that so we don't even have to think about it anymore? And so I can't give you like a blanket answer. Well, once you have two people, I mean, some of these things, once you have two people, you're gonna have to work on them. And some of these things, it's really just gonna depend on who you have. And that kind of leads into this second portion of my talk, which is about these processes. So agile development practices. He looks pretty agile, right? That's what yoga's about, right? Being agile, especially with chickens. Your agile development practices. Who here does agile development? Who here kind of does agile development? I see a lot of the same hands going up, right?
We're trying.
How many of you, if I sat down with you, could explain to me your process for getting work done? I see a few hands. I see a few hands that are like halfway up, right? So we sit down and, okay. So your stakeholder says, we want this feature, and you can tell me the process it goes through, all the way up to, we put it in production. I can tell you that about 2/3, maybe a little bit more of this room didn't raise their hand when I asked that question. I worked at a company, I'm not gonna name names. It is a company you've heard of. I did a contract with them for about 2 months. Guess how many features I delivered for them? 0. Why was that? Because every time, I went to the estimation meetings, went to the planning meetings, but every time I'd pick up a story to work on it, about an hour in, somebody would come to me and say, oh, I'm already working on that, and take it away. And so I'd go pick up the next one. And I'd have the same problem over and over and over again. They were practicing agile development. They were using a tool that kept track of all of that stuff. The problem is that their process was broken. So where's your process broken? I worked at another company. Both of these, I was consultant at both of these companies. We started holding estimation meetings before the estimation meetings. And the reason was because the way the Scrum Master ran the meeting, I should say meetings because the meetings usually ran over about 2.5 to 3 days to estimate for the 2-week sprint. It was easier to agree on the estimate beforehand and then have us all show up and just tell him how complex the story was. And that made it not so fun to work there. And so if you want to bring people in, you want to be that great place to work, you have to have these processes in place so that people know what they're doing and how they contribute. And if you're failing to do that, you're probably going to lose people just because they're frustrated. The flip side of this is I've seen people who love working at a company so much that they get offered a 20% raise that they turn down because they love working the way that they work at the companies they work at. And this is a part of it. And so I recommend, as you work through these processes, not just that you know what the process is, but that you have it written out. So that when somebody new comes in, or you're trying to explain to a stakeholder, or you're trying to explain to a client the process you go through, you can just sit down and say, look, this is how we do things. And then also, the other thing that this does is then if there is a deficiency in the process, you can sit down, you can pull it up, and everybody can look at the same process, and then you can decide what to change. And I think, to me, that's what Agile development's all about. All right. How many of you have ever been called in the middle of the night to fix a bug? How many of you got done fixing the bug and then senior management came in to try and figure out whose fault it was? How many of you have heard the words, somebody's getting fired tonight? So my first time as a team lead, we weren't delivering as quickly as they wanted. And my boss came in and said, somebody's getting fired tonight. Of course, I was the team lead, so the next thing he said was, and you're gonna figure out who it is. Which didn't make me happy. The problem was that we didn't have a process for dealing with things when they broke. And so when something goes wrong, you have to know what you're gonna do to fix it, and then what you're gonna do in your postmortem to make sure it doesn't happen again. And occasionally, the answer is gonna be, that programmer's too reckless, they've caused the last 3 of these doing the same thing, they haven't changed, so they have to go. But most of the time, you can put some kind of automated process in place, like testing, continuous integration, etc., to make sure that this kind of stuff doesn't happen. And how many of you want to work at the place that has that process in place? Right? Deployments and releases. Again, you know, I worked at that company. Okay, everybody show up at 10 o'clock, we're gonna do the deployment. And then something broken, so we're there all night. So understanding the process of deployment, here's what we do, here's how we do it, here's how we make it routine, here's how we test it, here's how we roll it back. And again, write it down. Write it down and then test it. And that way, when you show up to do the deployment, somebody can do it in their pajamas from their house, and you already know it's gonna work because you ran a test run earlier in the day. Or whatever your process has to be to make sure it's reliable. All right, let's talk about hiring. So how many here are hiring? How many of you work at a company that's hiring right now? I'm seeing a bunch of hands. How many of you have a process for hiring people? I saw maybe a little less than half of those hands go up. So how do you know what you want? How do you know what you're going to get? How do you know that you're going to get what you want? If you have this process in place, then you can start to hire these people in the first place and get to where you want to get. And all of these things, again, you can write it up, you can script it up so that you know we're going to bring somebody in, we're going to look at their resume, we're looking for these things. In the interview, we're going to go through this process with them to make sure that they are what we want. And then whatever other process you have, you know, you can quiz them, you can give them practice problems, all of these different things. But I will tell you that the number one problem most of the people I talk to who are having trouble holding on to their developers have is this. It's hiring. It's not the other processes, it's not the other things that we were laughing at with the deployments and blaming people for things going wrong. It's that they didn't know what they wanted when they started. They didn't know how to get it. And so they brought somebody in, and whoever they felt good about, they hired. And the reality is that if you want to work in a team that delivers what you want to deliver, and that can be culture, it can be fun, and all of the other deliverables that we do as programmers, then you can start to really pick on, that's what we're going to look for, and that's what we're going to do to make sure that they're the kind of person we want. And once you have somebody that lines up with the values that you have for your team and the things that you value on your team, then everything else starts to work for you. Onboarding. So that company that I worked for, where I'd show up and I'd pick a ticket and I'd start working on it and they'd take it away, they had a real problem with onboarding. I mean, their onboarding process was basically, okay, go work on stuff, right? And I was a consultant, so I brought my own computer and stuff. So they just gave me access to things when I complained I couldn't access things. But if you sit down and you make a concerted effort to know, okay, this is how we bring people on board. These are the kinds of things that we do to make sure that they are involved and that they feel like they're contributing. This is the access they need to all of these different things. This is the kind of computer they need. This is how we get them into the HR system. I mean, all of these processes, get all of that out of the way day one, day two. And then these are the kinds of issues that they can start handling for us on day one, day two, day three. This is who they're going to pair with. These are the meetings they need to be in. Does it make sense? But then we get these people in. We go through all the trouble of hiring the people that we want. We figured out what we wanted. We went through the process of making sure they were who we wanted. We made them an offer. They accepted. Make it really easy for them to just get integrated with your team. And yes, I know that sometimes it takes a while, especially with complicated system, for people to come up to speed. But if you have a plan for how they can get involved and how they can come up to speed, then it makes it a whole lot easier to make that the jumping off point to them becoming the kind of contributor that you want. Debugging. I mean, I've seen this approach, right? The part you don't see is when he comes back with another monitor, right? It's broken. I'll just rewrite it. I mean, how do we debug? What tools do we have? And this speaks to ongoing training, right? So as Angular changes, or whatever back end you're using changes, you know, what tools are coming with that? Do your people know how to use them? Or are they just shooting in the dark with the debugger in Chrome? And my favorite. Who here loves meetings? So, this is one of my pet peeves. I mean, when I was a consultant, it didn't matter so much because I just build them. If I was in a meeting, I'd build them. We talked about baseball for 2 hours, and they paid me for 2 hours. They felt good about it. And, you know, I try and wrap it up and bring it back to something of value, but sometimes it felt like some of my customers were just paying me to be their friend. And, you know, some people, they just wanted to get down to business, get stuff done, and get out of the meeting. Can you have a plan for meetings? Everybody do this. You can have a plan for meetings. It's called an agenda. And when you get to the end of the agenda, your meeting's over. And if you don't have a purpose of the meeting's over. But a lot of these things, I see people get hung up on these, and I'm sure you're thinking everybody's probably thought of at least a couple of things that their team could do better. And that's the whole point, right? Is think about these processes. How do we automate them? How do we make them better? How do we know what the next thing is? You know, with our deployments, it's, okay, run the build process, check it into the production branch. I mean, maybe you are SSHing into your production machine and doing a pull, get pull. But at least you know what your process is, and then you can make it better. Meetings. We keep having these meetings that go off the rails. Well, let's make a plan. Let's talk about it. I think this is the core of Agile development, this isn't working, this is what we're gonna do better. And if you can automate that much, we're gonna write down what we're doing, we're gonna know what the plan is, and then we're gonna talk about the plan and we're gonna make it better every week or every 2 weeks or however often we do these meetings to talk about this stuff. Then things get better and you start to have the kind of place that you wanna work. Now I have one more thing, and that's values, okay? Now I'm not talking about like those deep touchy-feely values, you know, that you hear about. But every team has something that they feel like is important, that makes up part of that culture, makes up part of the thing that people want to be part of your team for. And if you know what those are, whether it's delivering, whether it's doing big things, maybe you work in a field where you feel like you make a difference in the world. But if you can base all of this work on those values and those things that really matter to you, then it will inform the rest of these processes and the rest of the things that you are working on in your team. And it'll help you pick the right people to come be on your team. And it'll help you to move forward as a team in the ways that you want. So, yeah, I know I didn't talk a ton about Angular, but of all the things that people are asking me, I mean, this is it. It's how do we get done what we're trying to get done? How do we keep the people that we have? How do we find more people? And the answer is that if you have the same values as them, and your processes and your tools and your systems are all set up in service to that, and in service to making the deliverables deliverable, and making the job the kind of job that they want to have, it becomes a whole lot easier to bring those people in. And it makes it a whole lot easier to hold on to the people that you want to hold on to. And it also makes it a whole lot easier when you get to the point where you're maybe a little bit desperate in bringing in a junior developer. You can look at them and say, well, they have everything but the experience. And then we can put a tool in place or a process in place to make up the difference for them. But without this stuff, and I've been there, it feels a lot like when you're running around and trying to put those fires out. And that's just no fun.